I'm Stephen W. Long. This is The Writing Life. And in preparation for our program today, I was doing some research about our guest. And I came to the conclusion that if multitasking was an Olympic event, she would be a gold medalist. My guest is a wife, a mom, a homeschooler, a podcaster, I just learned a singer, a writer, a photographer, and what we want to talk about particularly is that you're now an illustrator of this book that's just coming out. So Katie Kulla, welcome to The Writing Life.
Thanks so much, Steve. It's really great to be here.
Yeah. You really did. In fact, I'm almost surprised that you found time to stop by. But we're going to do this.
Okay.
But you're a farmer.
Yep.
And I thought to kind of ground people, can you talk just a little bit about your farm?
Yeah. So how about my history in Yamhill County?
Perfect.
Because the farm is what brought me to Yamhill County.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So my husband Casey and I moved here in 2006.
Okay.
We had been working on a farm up in Washington, and we knew we wanted to make our living growing vegetables, and in the Willamette Valley specifically, to be closer to his family at the coast.
Okay.
And we landed in the McMinnville area because at the time there was no larger CSA-style farm serving the area. I mean, this is such a food community, you know, it felt like that was a big need. And so we moved here, rented land the first year, bought land our first summer out on Grand Island, which is where we still are.
Oh, okay.
And for 15 years, we operated a year-round CSA, providing vegetables to people most of the weeks of the year, mostly based here in McMinnville, although at different times we also delivered to Newburgh and sold to restaurants, and it was our full-time living for a long time.
Katie, let me interrupt just a little bit because I don't know some of this stuff. You say year-round.
Yeah.
So are those in the winter? I'm thinking two things. One is our climate is reasonably mild.
Yes.
But the other thing is, are those root vegetables? What do you do in the winter?
Yeah, there's a ton of food in the winter, actually, and I mean, we'll get to this, but part of what I'm really passionate about in my writing and my illustrating now is helping educate people about seasonal foods. It really delights me because to me, eating seasonally provides so much joy and diversity just built into life. You know, that what you're eating is always changing with the seasons. So what we were able to do on our farm was a combination of things. A lot of things will hold in the field here because, like you said, it is relatively mild compared to, say, Minnesota or Wisconsin. And we have some minimal protection we can provide. Row cover, which is like long pieces of cloth we could put over our crops. We have some high tunnels with plastic.
Okay.
So some things like cabbages and kale. But then we have a lot of storage spaces too. So we would bring in potatoes, winter squash, onions. So this time of year and on, the foods look really different than the summer. Cabbage, winter squash, potatoes, leeks, onions, garlic, a lot of different kinds of greens, a lot of chicory.
Okay.
Chicory, so in the radicchio family.
I didn't know we grew that here.
Yeah. Okay. So it was always fun. It was different every week of the year a little bit. Some things are surprisingly good at overwintering, like parsley.
No, I wouldn't have thought that.
Yeah, so we could have parsley in February and March, and it's such a fun flavor to have in that time of year, you know?
And again, I'm not knowledgeable about this, but CSA is?
It stands for Community Supported Agriculture. Okay. So it's like a subscription program. All of our farm members would sign up at the beginning of the season, and then we would commit to getting them vegetables for the weeks of the year that they had signed up for.
Okay. We're talking about writing.
Yeah, this is a writing show. But this is good because it's connected for me.
Well, I love that it permeates this. And in fact, I wanted to say that one of the things that you say on your website is paying attention. You use the phrase paying attention.
Yes.
And I think about, take this the right way, a comedian who does situational humor, maybe, Seinfeld. It's like observation. But poets are observers.
Yes.
You're an observer.
Sure.
And so and I think I read that you try to pass this on to your kids too, to have them be observers. But I love that what you write about is available really to all of us in some form or to some degree, but you observe it and you get down there and really kind of, here's a pun, dig out the facts about the thing. So I suspect that rural living enhances that.
Yeah, I mean, I think living rurally, which is different than remotely, because in the Willamette Valley, we're never very far away from a town.
Okay.
But yes, living out where we do, there's definitely a more intimate experience of the seasons and what's happening with the weather.
Sure.
And migrating animals and things like that.
Right.
And you know, before I started the farm, actually, they overlapped slightly. I finished a master's degree in creative nonfiction at Western Washington University.
Talk to you about that.
Okay. So I was working on that. For that work, I was writing personal essays in nonfiction, which so much of nonfiction writing is about specific detail.
Okay.
You know, it's very, not that those things can't show up in fiction too, but I feel like that is what nonfiction hangs on, is the real specific details. It's almost like you cross narrative stories with poetry in a way. And it's a hallmark of a nonfiction essay, for example, and some short stories too, is rather than finishing with the end of a story, you might finish with an image. So in that way, much more like poetry.
Okay.
Right? Because poetry often hangs on maybe a series of images that are being called into the reader's mind.
Sure.
So I think I brought that with me into farming. I could never stop being a writer,
Right.
even all those years of farming, even though I didn't have as much time to commit to my writing practice
Right.
in those years.
That's the next topic, except
Yes.
I want to know, what's the definition of creative nonfiction? And to me, they seem contradictory.
Yeah.
Creative would seem to be fiction. So just
Right.
fill me in.
Well, that's the big question. You can go to conferences and go to workshops and questions. What is creative nonfiction?
Yeah.
Some people call it, I think, the fourth genre. So I have my writing teacher, my mentor in graduate school, Brenda Miller. She and another writing teacher there have a book that's called Tell It Slant, which is a reference to the Emily Dickinson poem,
Okay.
Tell the Truth But Tell It Slant.
Okay.
Do you know this reference?
I don't.
Okay. I apologize to the universe if I'm butchering any part of that. I'm just pulling this from my memory. And that is a book about writing creative nonfiction.
Okay.
And so I feel like that sort of summarizes it, right? Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. It's approaching true stories, but still with the approach of literature and beauty and creativity.
Sure.
So an essay might be all things that happened, but the writer is spending time thinking about the form of that essay.
Okay.
So rather than maybe thinking of a journalistic approach where you think beginning, middle, end, not that journalism is always that straightforward,
Right.
but you're thinking, maybe I want to tell this story for my child, but I want to tell it in the form of a recipe.
Oh, okay.
Right? That would be an example of what might be called creative nonfiction.
Okay.
And that's actually a really specific example that Brenda Miller talks about called a hermit crab essay, where you choose a form that exists in the world and you crawl inside it and you write your essay.
Yeah.
Which is a really fun way to provide structure to a story, because we all have stories, right? We're walking around and we all have so many experiences in our lives that could be so meaningful to others. And how do you share them? The first step is to decide what the container is, right? And that's hard, right? You might have a story and think, well, is this a poem? Is this a novel?
Right.
Is this an essay? And then even if you decide it's an essay, Is it a 500-word essay? Is it a 2,000-word essay?
Right.
Am I going to have dialogue in it? Am I going to do it as a series of images? Is it going to be a list? Is it going to read like a story? So asking those questions and using the tools that we get from poetry, from fiction, maybe even from other genres like screenwriting, and bringing those in, I think that is probably what you mean when people say creative nonfiction.
Well, yeah, so there's a couple of examples. One is I have a friend who has written a memoir, and he's about my age and recalling dialogue from 6 or 7. So
right.
I think the gist, the meaning is there. Those might not be word for word what somebody said.
Oh yeah, no, dialogue is probably the number one place where somebody writing creative nonfiction is going to have to make decisions about how true it's going to be, right? Because if you want your piece to read like an engaging narrative story, which would usually include dialogue, you're going to have to give up adhering exactly to what happens.
Veracity. I know, now this is fiction, but my teacher said, we have to remember that dialogue is not real speech. Dialogue gives the illusion of real speech.
No, if you record people talking, it's actually very
weird. We're not
weird.
that sharp.
No, you wouldn't actually want to read. I do a lot of interviews for some of my writing.
Right.
Both for the podcasts that I co-host, but also for a book that's coming out next November. I interviewed over 20 different farmers.
Oh boy.
That book is about farming and parenting, and so I interviewed a bunch of different farm families.
Sure.
And then I had auto-transcripted transcripts so that I could make sure, in that case, because this is more journalism, I wanted to know I was quoting people very accurately, right? So I would read through the transcripts to remember what we talked about, and also to get really good, juicy quotes from them. And Stephen, they're the weirdest things. The way we talk when we're actually having a conversation, if you read it on the page, it is not compelling. People's sentences, typically when you read, the most typical construction is you have your subject, then you have your verb, and then you have your object. But when we talk, those come in all kinds of orders.
Sure.
It doesn't, we might start with one idea, pause, and back, anyhow.
And think about it.
It's
revise.
very different. So yes, writing dialogue is always an act of creation.
Well, my second example of creative nonfiction would be my dad. Mm-hmm. And he would tell us his history, maybe. And I, at one point, said to him, "Dad, is that true?" And he said, "Well, if it isn't, it ought to be."
Yeah.
And that's what maybe a little manipulated, but I think there was a kernel of truth in there.
Yes.
All right, so you talked about your education and how that manifests in your writing. Talk a little bit about that as well, because you did a newsletter.
Yeah.
I asked you about a blog. You said, I think I'm saying this right, it wasn't really a blog, but it was a weekly newsletter?
Yeah, so for the 15 years we had the farm, I wrote a weekly newsletter, which was also on our website, which was a WordPress website. So it was a blog, I suppose.
Okay.
But the purpose of it wasn't necessarily to reach random internet users. It was specifically for our farm customers. And I wrote that every week. I wrote 614 total over the course of the 15 years.
Isn't that something?
Yeah, and that was my most consistent writing practice in that time, simply because I was running a farm and having kids and doing other things. But
what an excuse.
But it was really important to me. It wasn't an afterthought.
Sure.
So we actually rented our first piece of land here outside of McMinnville before I had finished my master's degree.
Oh.
We had found the land, secured the lease on weekends. I think we even did a couple of times where we literally drove from Bellingham down to McMinnville and back in one day just to, meet someone or set up a lease or look at an apartment or whatever we were doing, which it's I think a 4.5-hour drive each way, maybe more. So those were long days. So we had seeds in pots before I had defended my thesis. I went back up and defended my thesis.
Yeah.
But before we had permanently moved down here, I had set up our website and started the blog.
Yeah.
So I remember specifically writing the very first entry in a computer lab at campus up in Bellingham, Washington, saying, we're going to do this thing, you know.
Yeah.
And so for me, I process the world through writing. You know,
Yes,
that's just,
yes,
it's just how I have to be. And so for me, the idea of having this really profound experience of starting this business and learning, I mean, the first couple of years were just so much painful learning.
Sure.
Expensive, painful, productive, but expensive, painful learning. I don't think I could have even done that if I hadn't had an outlet to be writing about it too.
Yeah.
That was just really important to me.
You used the word processing.
Yeah.
And I'm totally with you. I've used the word clarification.
Okay.
So sometimes I think you have ideas or experiences or something kind of swirling around, and when you write them down, it clarifies. Oh, that's now I know what I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and that may have been the at least cathartic, at least part of what you were up to there.
Yeah. I don't know, just understanding it.
Yeah.
Making sense out of it. I think those all work.
Okay.
Yeah. And in that time, I also did write a little bit. When I had my second child, it kind of fell off. But I did write articles for other farmers.
Sure.
For some farm journals and things too that were published. And but that was the bulk of my writing and creativity outlet, besides the farm, which is a very creative outlet too.
It is.
Yeah.
I love the physicality of it and all that. But I want to get to this.
Yeah, we
thing.
got to talk about this book.
Yeah. So one of the things that sort of drew me to you, or this whole thing, is that I think they approached you.
Yeah.
You didn't say, hey, I'm an illustrator, can I do that?
No.
They came to you.
Yeah.
And the thing that I like so much about that is that wouldn't have happened if you weren't out in the world and accepting. You were doing stuff and you cast the line or laid the trail or whatever. You're living your life rather than being kind of secluded. I don't know that this is making sense, but they came to you because you had done other illustrations.
Yeah, so so this is a book that's coming out October 24th. So what is that? Less than 2 weeks now here in the US. It's already out in the UK. So we've been talking a lot about farming and nonfiction. So to get us a little up to speed, at the end of 2020, my husband Casey and I decided to be done with the intense commercial part of our farming enterprise. We kept doing a lot of farming, and we still are, but the part that was taking up most of our time, it turns out we wanted time in life to pursue other things too. And the way we were farming year round was just very intense. So I decided that my piece of that is I really wanted to be writing again, and I didn't realize it, but I eventually also started drawing again, which I also have an art degree, mostly focused on photography and graphic design, but with lots of other drawing classes and things in the mix. So I started writing, submitting. I actually had this wonderfully magical moment where I think, well, I don't know, maybe there's writers out there who don't deal with doubt. I hear most of us do, right? So
if there are, we hate them.
If there are, that's fine. They don't need to watch a show like this. They're fine. So we had been so invested in farming, and I said, I want to write again, but to go from paid work to work that's unpaid and maybe won't ever make, I mean, we have no guarantees as writers that it will ever be financially lucrative, right?
Sure.
But you still have to put in the time. It was very, very hard for me to start setting aside time for something like that again. And I had a lot of doubt about it, a lot of insecurity. I had been kind of out of school long enough. I was like, I think I can still write. And I I have a special writing space, and I was like, I'm just gonna go over there. It's also a guest space, but in 2020 we didn't need that.
Right.
I'm gonna just go over there a certain amount of time every week, and I'm gonna just be in the space, and I'm gonna do something. And I didn't know what. And the first time I went over there, I was literally scared. Like I felt fear in my body.
I can understand that.
Yeah, like what am I gonna do here? What's gonna happen?
What if nothing comes to me?
What if nothing comes? I spent most of the time journaling.
Yeah.
You know, just trying to make sense of, okay, I've been farming for 15 years. I have a lot that I could be writing and processing and sharing with the world from that. Is that what I want to do next? Just trying to figure it out. And I went back to the house because I was in a space that didn't have internet. Went to check my email, and I got in my email an acceptance for this little piece I had sent to the Oregon Humanities Magazine. And I thought, oh, wow, it just kind of felt like the universe said, yeah, you should be doing creativity.
Right.
It was just beautiful, and it was enough to keep me going. So, long story short, I did start writing again. I did start publishing farming articles again at quite an intense rate, actually. I've had many articles and essays published over the last 3 years. I have a big stack of magazines.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. And I also found myself wanting to draw again, which I'd been doing a little tiny bit. I make a calendar every year for friends with seasonal plants, and I knew whatever I did, I needed a platform.
Sure.
Which I have very ambivalent feelings about social media, but
Right.
I knew, okay, if I ever want to have a book, they're going to expect me to be somewhere. So I got on Instagram. I was a late adopter. And I started posting photos, and then I was like, hey, it's visual. Why don't I draw things? So I started drawing vegetables and posting those on there, and I bought myself an iPad for my 40th birthday.
Oh.
And I started drawing digitally, and that I love that, and posting those on there, and that really like took my drawing game to a whole different level. Like I really love that, the ability to edit and all the tools I have on there. And so that was sort of just a side thing to build a platform, while I was simultaneously pursuing a book contract for this book that's coming out next November about farming and parenting. That was taking a long time. For anybody out there who hasn't written a book, it can be a long time. If you're dealing with a publisher, it can take a while to get a contract.
Yeah.
And one day I got this email from an editor out of London, from this publisher, Thames and Hudson, saying, hey, we like your illustrations on Instagram. Would you like to illustrate a book about edible plants?
And
it was so out of the blue.
it is, and there's no doubt about it. But again, I go back to, in some sense, you initiated this.
Oh, absolutely.
You put yourself
it out
there.
Yeah, which is what I try to encourage people to do when I share my story. It's such a classic example of, I got this amazing, truly life-changing opportunity.
Oh,
I mean, everything about this book has been so positive. Both the work experience of it, I went into it knowing that it would fundamentally change me as an illustrator. And I hadn't even necessarily thought of myself as an illustrator so much. I was starting to toy with that idea when they offered me the job. And then I was like, oh, yeah, no, that is what I'm doing. Okay. And I learned so much about the publishing world. I got to work with these two wonderful co-authors. So the text in this book is by two plant lovers, Kevin Hobbs, who's a horticulturalist in the UK, and Arthur Caesar Erlach, who is an ecologist and food communicator in Austria. And the book designer was in Australia. So it was a very global book.
We talked before the show a little bit about the world we live in now.
Yeah.
That communication.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, it feels like such a 21st century project.
Yeah.
They found me on Instagram. All the work was done through email and through video conferencing, and it was such a surprising and yet wonderful experience. And meanwhile, I also did get the book contract for the other book.
Naturally.
So the last year's been very busy. I basically wrapped this up right around the new year and dove headfirst into writing the farming and parenting book, which I think the working title, it's not quite finalized, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be Farm Raised Kids and some subtitle. And that's with Story Publishing. They do a lot of farm books.
I have to tell you, particularly through my wife, I have some exposure to farm-raised kids, and this is my prejudice, they're different, and by and large, they're better. And they're self-starters, they're problem solvers. Anyway, that's my pitch for farm-raised kids.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've had a lot of conversations over the last year with families. And
Well, let's make a commitment right now that you'll come back when that's out. All right.
Okay,
well,
so next November or so we'll connect again about
all right.
that.
Katie, there's so much to do here, but I just want to touch on this. This book talks about growing, cooking, serving various plants, where to obtain them. It talks about, am I right, foraging, climate change, plants in space.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So
I want to show you that
Oh,
one because
please.
that's one of my favorite spreads that I got to draw because I was like, really? Yes, plants in space is, so let's see. Okay, so so the way this book is organized is there's 70 plants, and
Right.
most of the spreads are text about the plant written by the authors, and then a portrait or
Right.
multiple drawings. That's what I did and contributed. It's over 150 illustrations total.
Yeah.
But then there are these inserts that are more topical, and one of them is plants in space. And thankfully, the book designer, she helped me a lot with some of the more conceptual illustrations, thinking about potential, how we're going to illustrate something like this. So she would, and the authors too, would have some suggestions, but I'm the one who was doing all the research, getting reference photos, coming up with how I wanted to depict this. So, and then I would have the text to look at too for ideas. So one of the things they're talking about this is climate control, and so they were talking about the first greenhouses. So I thought, okay, I'll do a greenhouse. And then they were talking about how they're actually growing plants on the space station. So I found imagery of that, which is copyright-free photographs. So I was able to draw from those. So this is actually, I think, arugula growing in space.
Okay. Without gravity,
yeah.
I wonder if it confuses the plant.
I mean, that's.
Or maybe it goes toward the light source. I don't know.
I think that's the experiment.
Okay.
I don't know. I didn't, because I was doing 150 illustrations, my ability to wrap my head around each plant and topic was a little bit limited to what I needed to know to make sure that my illustrations were botanically accurate and also interesting.
So that was one of my questions.
Yes.
I read through the list. Most of the plants I didn't know.
Yeah.
Some of them I did.
Me neither.
I suspect that some of them you didn't.
Yeah.
So how do you know what to draw? You did research. Okay.
Yeah, so the authors would send me, we did it in batches, they would send me an email with, sometimes it had their text, sometimes it didn't, the scientific name, and they would send a few sample images just to help me know, because some of these plants have multiple forms, or there's very different plants that have similar names, so they wanted to make sure that I'm getting the right imagery.
Yeah, yeah.
And then it was my job to go out, and I mean, thank goodness for the internet.
Absolutely.
Right? So and in order for the book to, my goal as an illustrator is to have my images be original. I was gathering multiple images and then making a composite.
You're not copying.
Right. I can't directly copy one photograph.
Right.
I can pull from multiple photographs.
The leaves in these different pictures kind of look like this.
Right.
Yeah.
And with plants, it's not as tricky to do as if I was trying to do a person. Then, I don't know, plants kind of just look like themselves, right?
Sure.
But yes, my goal was to have as many different good photos to pull from, in part so that I could educate myself about what features are the most consistent
Right.
here and what do I want to highlight? Because
Right.
one of the cool things about botanical illustration versus just photos of plants is that the artist can highlight features to make them more recognizable
Right.
in a way that you can't in a photograph.
Sort of
so-
unique features. Katie, we don't have enough time. Yeah. So, but I do want to
Yeah.
tell people you don't have to go to England to buy the book.
No.
It's going to be out.
Yes.
And it'll be available regular places and
Yes.
locally. We know where that is. And
Yes, so,
Yeah.
and actually I'm having an event at the library
Oh,
on
wow, great.
Wednesday, October 25th at 6 p.m.
okay.
I'll be having a conversation about the book, and Third Street Books will be there selling books, and
Fabulous.
I can sign them.
Fabulous. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm so glad we committed to do the next one because this went by too quickly.
Yeah.
So, darn it. That's it, everybody. This is The Writing Life. I'm Stephen W. Long. Oh, do your website.
Oh, yes, my website is just my name, Katie Kulla, as one word.com.
Okay.
So KATIEKULLA.com. And I have lots of links and information
Yeah.
about my different projects there.
Yeah, go there. It's great. I've looked at it. Mine is stephenwlong.com, so visit me. I'm lonely. And see you next time on The Writing Life. Thank you so much. That was
Thank you.
went too fast.
Oh my gosh, I know. We got derailed talking about the what is